All right, so welcome back to the next episode of my NHL Deep Dive series. Today we are talking about the Minnesota Wild. And the Wild kind of kick off this new tier of teams in this ranking, and this is kind of the playoff hopeful tier. This is the teams that aren't just focused on the NHL draft coming up, they're focused on potentially long shot playoff aspirations, kind of outside looking in, but they're not really focused on being like a bottom of the barrel team. They're more concerned about potentially, making a run. If everything goes right, they could do some damage in this weekend. That's kind of what this tier is. So first of all, Minnesota's offseason moves. There was a lot of movement, but there wasn't a ton of like impact movement, if that makes sense. So look at their forward acquisitions. I think Yakov Trennin's the best player that they brought in, and probably the best player to both leave and get brought in. Like, of all the players that switched here with Minnesota, he's probably the best. Shore and Boyd are probably the next two forward wise, and then they just brought in a couple depth guys. Even Shore and Boyd are kind of depth guys too. Like, I don't think they'll be everyday players anyway. But Yakov Trenin's kind of the big piece. They lose Letary, they lose Mason Shaw, which I think I liked Mason Shaw. Like, he was fine. So really, there's not a whole lot of big losses on this team either. So, like I said, they're slightly upgraded because I think Yakov Trenin's better than anybody they lost, and they filled like the guys they lost with other guys, so it's fine. But obviously, the team with the cap issues they've had, the buyouts and everything, they couldn't do a whole lot. So this is kind of the situation they were in. Defensively, they lose Goligoski. That's the big loss there. Mermis as well goes, but Goligoski was like the bigger name, I guess. They didn't add anybody, which I don't think is that big of a deal. Like, it's not a huge loss. I slightly downgraded them just because they didn't replace the depth with anybody. They're just kind of going to bring guys up from Iowa and hope that some of their other prospects can step up. And they didn't do anything in net. So that's the Wild's offseason. As much as like there's players on the board, the actual, like, in terms of impact to the roster, there really wasn't a whole lot that changed with Minnesota. So it's kind of a weird offseason for them in that sense. But now let's move on to the forward core. That's pretty well the same as it was last season. So offensively, this is easily the strong suit of this team, which is weird to say for a Minnesota team that like has been constantly known for their blue line being the strength of the roster. I definitely think it's the forward group, and they rank 13th, which is extremely good, especially based on where we are in the whole deep dive series. Like, this forward core is very solid, and it's led by Kirill Kaprizov, who is still one of the best players in the NHL. Despite the fact that he really, like, after his rookie season, I find that like the general NHL audience doesn't talk about him as much as they probably should, and I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just because he plays in Minnesota and they're kind of like on a downswing on what their team usually is. But I mean, Kirill Kaprizov rocks. Like, he is so good. He is one of the best play drivers in the NHL. He's so dynamic offensively, and he easily deserves to be in like the second highest tier in the league. He's somebody that any year could just break out and win MVP, and I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. And that's kind of what the A tier is, like, more or less. I think this is the first player that we've had in the A tier. At least for forwards. I think Mackenzie Weegar was for defense, but forward-wise, I think this is the first player that we've seen in the A tier, and that's basically what it is. It's just somebody that any year he could just win the heart, and people would be like, yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, Kaprizov rocks. He's very good at a lot of things. Defensively, he lacks a little bit, but even there, it's not like bottom of the barrel league-wise, so it's like it's passable for what he brings offensively. I feel like the guy that I'm going to get a bit of pushback here on is Joel Eriksson at an A-. And listen, if you were fond of Nick Suzuki at an A-, Joel Eriksson is pretty well like the identical player. Just maybe not stylistically, but like in terms of like impact. Points-wise, points per 60 over the last two seasons, they're virtually identical. And Joel Eriksson played less games, so his numbers are less, but like points per minute, per 60 minutes, Joel Eriksson and Nick Suzuki are like, they're basically the same. And honestly, like, underlying number wise, like, Joel Eriksson kind of grades out a little bit better. So like, for some reason, people just don't want to recognize him as like one of these high-end centers in the NHL right now, and he really is. He's been very good over the last couple of years. And again, I think that might just be because he plays in Minnesota. They don't get a lot of national attention. And he's not flashy, right? Like, he's not a Kaprizov or a Matt Baldy or like even a Rossi or even a Zuccarello, who like is more of a flashy player. Joel Eriksson just kind of, he does all the things really, he does all like everything really well. And even his point totals, like I said, like they're on par with Nick Suzuki. So like, yeah, he rocks. I love Joel Eriksson. He's one of my favorite players in the NHL. And he's definitely deserving of being an A-. Matt Baldy's an interesting one. Obviously, he blew onto the scene his rookie season and just, like, was unstoppable. Last year was solid. It's hard to take a step up from his rookie year, but he had a good sophomore season. I really liked what I saw from him. I think there's still a lot of room for development. He's somebody that I'm really looking forward to taking a massive step this year as well. And you can throw Marco Rossi in there too as somebody who really took a pretty substantial step last season. He looked very good when playing, and with all his health concerns and everything that happened, it was very, very nice to see him finally be able to step into the roster full time and play like a top 6 NHL center. And obviously, if he does end up playing with Kaprizov again and Zuccarello, it'll help offensively for sure. Playing with great players is going to benefit players, of course. But I really liked what I saw from Rossi last year, and I expect him to also take a big step this year. And hopefully he can stay healthy. Hopefully everything's kind of past him with that, because he was a very fun player last year as well. And again, Minnesota, a team that's been known for like their stout defensive game and like very playing the right way, as people like to say, whatever that means. Now they're kind of this flashy like offensive team, and it's been a weird transition. It's kind of like my brain doesn't want to like compute that, but that's kind of what they are now. And you can throw Matt Zuccarello in there too as somebody he's very streaky. I would like this team to add another winger, just to kind of like, or at least like hope that somebody develops, kind of take that Marcus Johansson slot. I mean, obviously you have Ryan Hartman there too in the bottom 6, but I really like Ryan Hartman there. But Zuccarello is just a little too streaky for me. Like there's days where he could be a B plus player. There's days where he could be a C plus C player. So he gets a B minus. It's kind of in the middle. That's the rationale there, basically. Ryan Hartman's another guy who, as a depth piece, I very much like. I actually really like the depth on this team. I like Frederic Rudra. I love Marcus Foligno. And Ryan Hartman, that line, if that will be the third line for Minnesota, it is according to Daily Faceoff, as of the time of me making the graphic. I really like that line. That's a very, very difficult third line to play against, and it's a third line that can generate offense too. And I think that's what the best teams have. Like, you look at Colorado and their cup runs, right? Like they had, the Lekkonens on that third line who could play great defense, but also could generate offense. And, Tampa Bay is with Coleman and Gord and Goudreau. Like, those guys could all generate offense too. And I see a very similar third line here in Minnesota. Maybe not to the same caliber of player as Tampa Bay's was, but a similar style. And just very difficult to play against and very two-way oriented. And I really like all three of those guys. That's an interesting line. Their fourth line, I think, leaves a little bit to be desired. We'll see who ends up taking those center and left wing slot. I think Yakov Trenton's pretty well locked into that right wing spot, or at least he should be out that one slot. But I think there's a lot of fluctuation that could happen in that bottom line. So that's kind of interesting to watch. But overall, like, this offense is good, and it's obviously, it's the top half of the league. At least now is where it ranks, and there's a lot to like here. I don't think there's a lot to dislike. Obviously, like the fourth line, there's questions for me, but other than that, the fourth line and like a sixth forward in the top 6 is kind of like the two things that stand out to me as potential issues for this team. But I think there's definitely bigger issues on this team, and we're going to get to those shortly. The forward core is very nice, and I would be very happy if this is just the team that Minnesota runs with for the whole season offensively. I think they'd be perfectly okay. And that's good because they really don't have a lot of money because they're paying Ryan Suter and Zach Parise a bunch on buyouts. Yeah, I think this forward core is really nice, and it's only going to get better because all these guys are pretty young, and there's nobody other than like Zuccarello, really, and I guess Johansson, but I don't know if that's like it's kind of just a stopgap on that top six right now. Like the core of this team is still very young, so there's still a lot of runway for this team to get even better. And I think that's a very scary thing to think about because there's a lot of talent here already. So watch out. Minnesota could be kind of a fun offensive team that people really aren't like taking seriously as like a real like high-end offensive team because they have never been really like. But yeah, I like this forward core. I think it's very good. And for the Wild fans out there, we kind of go from good to okay to bad is how this video is going to go. So it's just going to get worse from here. But there's the good news for you. The forward core rocks. Hang your hat on that. Offense can win you games in the regular season. So I wouldn't be surprised if the team does a lot better than where I have them ranked right now, just based on that. So defensively is where this team's kind of in a transition right now because you have your Brodins and Spurgeons who were the big pillars of this blue line, and both of them have started to deteriorate a little bit. I have them both at B pluses still because I think there's still enough leeway there for them to still be very effective defensemen. Brock Faber obviously was the best defensive rookie in the NHL last season. He was extremely fun, right? Well, maybe not obviously. I think you make arguments for a couple other guys, but he was my best rookie defenseman in the NHL last season. And he's somebody, again, that I think is going to take a pretty major step forward again this year. He's going to get a ton of work, and Minnesota's been very good about just throwing him into the fire, and as long as he has shown that he can handle it, they'll just keep piling on the responsibilities, which is good because, again, Brodin and Spurgeon can't be those like pillar defensemen anymore. So you're giving Brock Faber a lot of those roles, and he is really developed into that kind of player, and I think there's not a doubt in my mind that he's going to be maybe even like into the A- tier by the end of this season. Like he could really pop off if given the right opportunity. Jonas Brodin is still one of the best shutdown defensemen in the NHL. His ability to, and it's funny because he's not a big like physical defenseman, but his ability to just shut down rushes like the second they happen, like his ability just to stand up people at the blue line and just force dump-ins, force turnovers, force bad passes is so good, and it's something that you won't really appreciate. Like even if I could show you the numbers of like him being in the top of the NHL forever in those things, but it's something that you really won't appreciate until you actually watch him do it because it's very subtle and he's very good at it. And I'm sure Wild fans will attest to that in the comments of this, talking about how good he is at doing stuff like that. And it's such a joy to watch. And I'm just, as much as we have Jonas Brodin like as a good defenseman, I want to appreciate that as much as possible while he's still doing it because it's so much fun. Like I love stuff like that, and he's very much my kind of defenseman for that. I mean, his transition game's still very good too. His offense isn't quite there, but it never really was. But his ability to get out of the zone with the puck is very good. His ability to find outlet passes is very good. But I think that's really the big thing that stands out for me with Jonas Brodin is his ability just to shut down rushes before they even happen. And it's an art, and he is one of the best I've ever seen to do it. So, especially in his prime, maybe not now, but prime Jonas Brodin was just disgusting. Like, it was unreal. Same with Jared Spurgeon. I mean, Spurgeon, same thing. Just one of those defensemen who is still very good just at, like, everything. He doesn't really stand out in any particular, like, skill set, but Jared Spurgeon can kind of do everything. And if he can play and he's healthy and he's able to get back to kind of where he was maybe 2 years ago, having that kind of Swiss Army knife as like maybe your third best defenseman by the end of the season is super valuable. The rest of the blue line, I have question marks about. Declan Chisholm is somebody they brought back, and he had moments of being a competent NHL defenseman in both Minnesota and Winnipeg. I just haven't seen enough of it yet to like put him above the D category. Same with like Jacob Middleton, who I like as a depth piece, but I think you kind of need one more defenseman in that top four to really solidify. Like if Middleton and Bogosian is your bottom pair, I think you're doing okay. And then maybe Chisholm can step up and really to elevate. Maybe they go get somebody. I don't know. But that's kind of my biggest concern here is they just kind of need, similar to the forward core where I think that they need like one more forward, they also need one more defenseman in that top four. And I guess the hope is Chisholm becomes that. As for Zach Bogosian, I was really surprised at how good of a season he had last year. Like when Minnesota brought him in, I pushed back quite a bit, I guess, on the decision, but he ended up having like a very, very solid season in Minnesota by the end of that year. Like he was super competent as a third pair defenseman, and that's why he gets the C- grade. I think he deserved it. For all the jokes that everybody's made about Zach Bogosian for years, it was a very solid year, and he didn't do anything special offensively. He just kind of was able to make sure that nothing happened when he was on the ice, and I think that's the most you can hope for a sixth defenseman that you're paying nothing. And he did that very well. So shout out to Zach Bogosian for still being a competent NHL defenseman. I did not have that on my bingo card, but when I was going through Minnesota and doing their ratings, that really stood out to me. So there you go. Overall, I think the pieces are here. I think I'd be very concerned if I'm a Wild fan if Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin deteriorate more, because there really isn't a safety net behind them. And I think that's the biggest concern with this blue line is the fact that like if Spurgeon does take a step back, as he's kind of been going that way the last year or two, that concerns me. Brodin taking a step back would concern me a lot, because then you're kind of just left with Brock Faber and a bunch of guys you'd probably want your second or third pair. And based on what this team has in net, that doesn't bode well for Minnesota long term. That's my biggest concern with this team. It's a very tenuous situation on the blue line. I don't think it's like in red alert, like panic button mode yet, but it's like even one of Brodin or Spurgeon either going down with an injury or taking a huge step back away from potential disaster levels on this blue line behind Brock Faber. And that kind of worries me a little bit. Obviously, they have prospects coming out, like Bouillon is great. I love that pick, but he's not going to play for at least another year after this season. So, yeah, you need to kind of find solutions now. You can't just hope on a player like that coming up in 2 or 3 years and fixing it. So, yeah, it's the blue line for this team. Again, there's a lot of guys I really like here. I love Jared Spurgeon. I love Jonas Brodin. I wish them the best. But the lack of a safety net concerns me a little bit. Now, when looking at this goalie tandem, there's a big, massive Jesper Wallstedt-shaped elephant in the room that I feel the need to talk about, because there's a very good chance that Jesper Wallstedt makes this team, and a lot of my concerns about this goaltending tandem disappear because he beats out Marc-Andre Fleury fairly easily for the backup position, and Minnesota suddenly becomes fine because I think Jesper Wallstedt is going to rock. The problem is that hasn't happened yet. So this is what they're left with. They're left with the 29th best goaltending tandem because Philip Gustafsson played a big role last year and he took a step back. And that was unfortunate because 2 years ago he was really good, and it was hard to watch because I was a big Philip Gustafsson fan a couple years ago, and they gave him the kind of the keys to the kingdom, and it didn't work. It didn't work the way they hoped, and maybe it was just a down year. Maybe not having kind of a fluctuating blue line didn't help either. But whatever the case may be, if he can't regain where he was, 2 years ago, I'd be worried, especially if Wallstedt can't step in and take over that spot. And I mean, you probably don't want Jesper Wallstedt stepping in, becoming your true starting goalie this year anyway, because that's a lot of pressure to put on a young kid. So if Philip Gustafsson's kind of regain some of what he had a couple years ago, I think that would be very positive. And that's why I think I'd like Wallstedt over Fleury as the backup here, or at least run a bit of a tandem, because then you can eat more of Gustafsson's games and kind of get him back into that tandem mode and not make him, a starter. That might help. Give him a bit of less of a workload, and you might see better results from Gustafsson. As for Marc-Andre Fleury, I mean, like, it's tough watching a player that was so dominant for so long kind of fizzle out like this. But it's been a rough couple of years for Marc-Andre Fleury. And I hope that he can, come in, play 15, 20 games this year, look fine, and then ride off into the sunset with, a positive final season. That would be the ideal. There's also a very good chance that he plays like 10 games and he's awful, and Minnesota just feels the need to continue to play him because it's Marc-Andre Fleury and the name value's there and he's going to sell jerseys and people are going to want to come see him. I hope that's not the case. I hope he can come in and kind of rekindle a bit of what he was a couple years ago and be like a competent backup. But it's a big, I mean, again, Jesper Wallstedt's kind of the big elephant in the room here too, because if he can come in and all of a sudden he looks like a very competent goalie and Philip Gustafsson bounces back a little bit, then Marc-Andre Fleury is kind of sitting there holding the bag and you kind of don't have a choice but to not play him, right? So it's a very... I feel like the back end of this team, both in defense and goaltending, is very iffy, right? There's a huge wide range of outcomes for Minnesota this year. And some of them are very good. Like if Brodin and Spurgeon don't fall off and Declan Chisholm steps up and can become, a fifth defenseman on a team, and Brock Faber takes another step and becomes a true number one guy, and Philip Gustafsson finds his game again, and Marc-Andre Fleury looks competent, Jesper Wallstedt comes in, and all these things work out, then it's like Minnesota's a playoff team, right? Because the offense is there. Like I have no concerns about the offense, or very little concerns about the offense, at least like in a playoff caliber conversation, right? Maybe if we're talking about like deep playoff runs, then the conversation changes a little bit, but at least like making the playoffs, I have no concerns about the offense. There's also a world where none of those things happen for the blue line and defense, and this team just bottoms out. And I think it's a very wide range of outcomes, which is why they're ranked where they are, because I'm basing these rankings not on projecting where I think a team's going to end up. It's based on what they've shown me over the last, year to 2 to 3 years, weighing more towards last season. And Minnesota had a down year last year, so that's reflected in where they're sitting. And they really didn't do anything, at least outwardly, to fix those things. Again, there's potential for bounce backs, there's potential for development, there's potential for players not regressing. But that's all hypothetical. And that's why Minnesota is where they are at right now. And I think, again, they're a super fascinating team. There's a lot to like here. There's a lot of players that I very much enjoy personally. And I want them to work out. Like I said, like I like this team, but I just think there's too many questions there's too many question marks on this roster to have them higher than this. And maybe all those things align and Minnesota's a playoff team, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. But for now, this is the best I can do for you, Wild fans. Anyway, that is all I got for the Minnesota Wild. Let me know what you think down below. I think Minnesota's a super wide range of teams. There's going to be a lot of people who think I'm super low on them. Maybe some people think they should have been on the rankings already. I don't know. But yeah, let me know what you think about the Wild down below. And now we're kind of getting the next like 7 or 8 teams are all like extremely close in my like overall score ratings. So this is going to be a very interesting next couple of videos, because I feel like people are going to disagree heavily with my order of these teams, which is fine. Like this is supposed to be a discussion. I'm not an expert. And I hope this sparks some good conversation. So thank you guys for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Also follow the Instagram. It's just NBA Hockey again. I can't put links in my description for some reason. I don't know, YouTube's been weird, so I can't link it in the description, but it's just NBA Hockey. You can look it up. I'll post updates and stuff there and other content that isn't found here. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.